My friend was quoted over $2,000 for two what I think might be simple repairs on her car. Today what we're going to do is we're going to see if those repairs are actually needed. If so, we're going to try to get it done for less money to help save her a little money in her pocketbook. This is another German car that we're working on. I've never worked on one of these before in any way, shape, or form, so I'm kind of going to be flying blind, but I think we'll be able to make it work. Let me show you what we're working on. Now, before anybody goes and gets mad and says, shops have to make money, why would you not believe them, yada, yada, yada. I get all of that. The point of my videos is not to bemoan or cry or whine about the cost of repairs necessarily. It's to show you that you can do it at home. So I'm not saying going to a shop is bad. In fact, I worked at a shop for many years of my life. I get it, it's expensive. This is why we have tools at home. This is why we have YouTube to learn how to do these things. So let's move on past that to what's wrong with this car. There are two distinct problems with this car, one of which is symptom-based and one of which the customer or my friend had no idea about. The first is she was driving and the power steering light turned on. She thought it was low on fluid. There is no fluid, electric steering on this car. So that was symptom number one. Symptom number two is that the daytime running lights and the headlights kind of flicker and flash as she's running. Symptom number three, that when she turns the AC on, it's Phoenix, it's October, it's still in the 110s, and she goes full blast and she's got the radio pumping and she's sitting at a stoplight, it kind of burbles and warbles and doesn't run quite right. But there are no other signs on the dash, anything like that. So what that led us to believe was that we had an issue with power. So maybe we have a bad battery. In this case, we can go ahead and test it. I've got my Ansel battery tester. This is the BA101. I'll have a link down below so you can pick one of these up. We're going to go ahead and we're going to hook up to it. We're going to say battery in vehicle, battery test. It says to check the surface charge, turn on the lights, headlights, yada, yada, yada for 10 seconds. I've done that already. We're going to hit enter. We've got a flooded 730 cold cranking amp battery, and we're going to hit test. Test shows good. We've got 719 cranking amps, charge at 96%, 12.62 volts. That's really good. Internal resistance of 4.07 mega ohms. Next, what could cause electrical dysfunction or malfunction in a car? The alternator, right? So let's do this. We're going to be battery in vehicle. And we're going to go to charging test, and it pulls up ripple test. So I'll go ahead and start the car. The car starts up just fine. It says we have to increase RPM to 2,500 to 3,000 RPM. There's just one of me, so I'm going to use my brake pedal depressor. I'm going to hit enter, and it's testing. It says that we don't have any alternator output, ripple of 0 millivolts. Currently the waveform is showing 13.8 volts, which is actually good. Now, yesterday when I was testing this, it was only reading 12.8. The alternator wasn't putting out any voltage, which tells us that we either have a voltage regulator or an alternator that's getting weak and dying with time. Given that it's been so hot lately, perhaps temperature has something to do with it. So the next issue that we're dealing with is a failing water pump. Now, I made a boo-boo yesterday. My friend dropped the car off and I diagnosed everything, looked at everything yesterday. And I also cleaned the entire engine bay and the side, or technically front of the motor, because I like working on cleaner engines. And I washed off what was the trail of coolant that was running down the side here. So I can't show you that because I cleaned it off. Now, there was one other recommended repair by the shop, and that was motor mounts. And the motor mounts are loose. They're not physically torn all the way through. The lower wishbone here looks halfway okay. The upper mount has some movement to it. And I think they were actually recommending mounts because I have to unbolt the wishbone and unbolt at least the top mount to jack the motor up to get to the water pump. So while you're in there, but my friend didn't know that because they didn't say that. They just said, you need motor mounts, which added to the cost of the repair. At that point, it was like $3,500 with motor mounts. So yesterday, we actually ordered a water pump coolant and the alternator from FCP Euro, and it's here today paying for expedited shipping. Now, I think that that was the case because we live in Phoenix and they just built a new warehouse out here. So that's pretty cool. So what we're gonna do is we'll start underneath. We're gonna have to jack up the motor anyhow to get to the alternator, to get it to fit out, at least from what it looks like. I think if I take the bolts out of the dog bone here, that the engine's not gonna fall out. This is just to control rotational movement, where the mount on the top sides is what keeps it from falling out. We're gonna go ahead and get started by popping the right front tire off. Behind the tire, we're gonna have the forward fender liner. Getting that off is going to give us access to the belts a little bit easier. I'm gonna use a 15 mil to pop the lower belt off, and then I'm gonna use a belt tool that's super shallow to get the alternator tensioner loose and the belt off there. I'm gonna go ahead and remove that tensioner. That's right there with the number 12 triple square, so that I have a little easier access to the bottom alternator bolt. Remember to disconnect your battery before you get too far along into here and wind up shocking yourself or damaging the car. To pop off the coolant bottle, we have to disconnect the washer fluid holder and 2 T25s. We're going to pull that back and over to the side and drip coolant all over my feet here. On the motor mount, we've got a bolt there, bolt over here, that bracket there, and it looks like it mounts here to the block. Possibly on the other side. I don't see anything on the other side. For the alternator, we already got that bottom bolt. Then we've got one more hidden right there behind that pulley, so we'll have to take that off. And then not the alternator, but the water pump, that's back behind the bracket. Removing this top motor mount, we're going to break the bolts free first by hand, then we'll use our electric tools to pull them out. I'm doing this to make sure that there's no adverse tension on there that I'm going to wind up stripping something. I do have a jack underneath the motor right now to make sure that it's not going to move around too much. And before we can take the bolts off of the front of the block, we're going to have to lift the motor up. That way we'll have a little bit better access. Starting on the front here, you got those 2 bolts right on the front. I can't remember if these are 13s or 15s. And then I'm kind of stumped. I'm like, why won't this thing come off? Oh, there's a bolt all the way down there. I found the access. There's an opening behind the upper inner fender liner. So you got to pull that loose and then go in right there behind it. With the motor mount out of the way, I got to proceed with trying to get those stupid little bolts out of the water pump. There are 3 T30s in there, and these are M8 bolts. They are not tight at all, but they are very difficult to get to with the mount on the chassis there getting in the way. So I took my time and I just, one click at a time was able to get on those guys and get them out. All right, well, I couldn't get the damn pump out without taking the other motor mount loose over there. So now all 3 motor mounts are loose. I've got 2 jacks underneath and it's out. You can see down here where our pump goes. We need to clean this flange. And I'm gonna clean it up with a little bit of Brillo pad or Scotch-Brite. Now, executive decision. Before I go for that water pump, I'm gonna try to get the alternator out. Got one more bolt right here at the top. That one down there is loose. We'll see if we can squeeze it out the top. Whoa, that doesn't look good. Now we got to pry the alternator back. 2. Okay. Now we got a connector and a power cable on the back side. Try to slide this up out of the way. Here's our connector. The wire's connected to the bottom down there. All right, we got the motor out just far enough that we can get this guy up and out of the way. Okay, drop this guy in. Reinstallation of the alternator was really not all that difficult. It was actually much easier to get it in place with the motor jacked up like this. I had just a little bit more room to get back there to tighten up the lug on the power cable, get the plug plugged in, and then
screw around with trying to get it to line up on the two mounts. It took me a hot second, but eventually I got it. Then from this point, it was much easier, like I said, to get the bolts in and tightened from this point with the motor up in the air.
We have all three motor mounts loose right now. Really makes it a wrestle. Really, what needs to happen is the motor needs to come up and forward for this to work. But if you come up too high, you run into the brake master. So then you got to pull it over like this. Try to find the right angle without damaging our impeller. It's really close right there. I guess I'll lift the tranny side up a little bit more. There it is. Slide it in there, take the pressure off of everything else we're leaning against. Now we can rotate it, find the right orientation. Let's see, the weep hole goes down. So if we can start with one of our bolts up top, that's going to help us to get the other three lined up. Whew. Then we can lower it back down onto the motor mounts.
At this point, it was really important to have the camera on time-lapse because, no joke, I probably spent 40 minutes, 45 minutes trying to get these three bolts in. I would get it, what I thought was lined up, then I'd drop it, then I'd use a magnet to get it back out, and then I'd drop it, and then I'd drop it, and then I'd drop it, and it fell down in coolant, it was slippery. You get the drift. Eventually, you do get them in there. It did help tremendously to have the motor jacked up super high, and it all worked out. Tighten these down to about 10 Newton meters. Like I said, they are an M8. I wasn't able to get a torque wrench in there, but I went about 10 Newton meters. With that miserable water pump out of the way, it was time to get the rest of this guy installed. So I started by getting the alternator tensioner back in there. It was, like I said, easier from the top than the bottom. I should have known that before. Then the idler pulley with the three little T30s on there. These are the same size as the water pump bolts. And then we can route our belt around. Make sure you take a picture of the belt or something before you take it off, just in case. I have it on video, so it was easy enough for me to go back and look, see how it was on there. It takes a little bit of time to get this guy going. It's a bit fiddly. What I found was it was easier to get around the tensioner and then wrap it around the idler than it was to try to put it on the tensioner because it was in the way of my tool. Then we're going to go ahead and get our cooling system reinstalled and start this bleeding by filling it up. Really, to bleed this cooling system is pretty simple from what I found. You put all of your stuff back together, fill it up to the top, let it go gurgle, 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 and do that a couple of times till it stops. If you can reach one of the coolant hoses, give them a good squeeze to push some of that air around, and then fire the car up with the interior on heat. That way you know you're getting good flow to the inside.
If you've gotten anything that's helpful out of this video, drop down below, hit like, subscribe if you want to see more. Let's get to our water pump. I couldn't show you that it was leaking, but on the bench here, I can. If you look right down in the bottom of your water pump, there's a weep hole or a spot that when it fails internally, it's to show you that there's a problem. And what winds up happening is it leaks out the front past the bearing set, and before the bearings fail, it comes out there. If you don't address it soon enough, eventually you'll have a seized or damaged bearing, which will cause all sorts of issues. So I can see here that it was leaking. I could see on the car that it was leaking, but then I cleaned it off and you couldn't see. On the back side, it's also pretty darn flattened out. The original O-ring, it was time to replace it. The alternator, it's fixed as well. I wound up running a secondary alternator test again after I got everything together because it's important to verify our repairs, and my little tester found exactly what it needed. So were we able to save my friend a little bit of money? Yes. So the quote that she got was for $2,130. That included a water pump and an alternator. I'm charging $800, and that included a rental car. I have an extra car. I gave her an extra car to go do all her things with. I also washed the car, vacuumed the inside, and cleaned it up so that she gets back something better than the way she dropped it off. At the end of the day, this is a job that you can take on yourself with just a little bit of knowledge and tools. Was it difficult? Yes, I have some skills. I've never worked on one of those cars before, and this took me way longer than it probably should have. if I were to do it again, now I know that I'm just gonna pull all 3 mounts, lift the whole engine up and out of the way, and I'll have much better access. In fact, my teenager was looking at this car going, I could probably get one of these. And so who knows, maybe he'll wind up buying one and I'll have to fix it too. Or at the very least, show him how to fix it and I can be the backseat driver pointing and having him do stuff. Thanks again for watching. Hope you enjoyed this one. I look forward to seeing you in the next one real soon.